Welcome to the first module in Rural Valuation. In this module, we basically introduce the whole area of rural valuation. And I want to make an argument for the importance of rural valuation and, in fact, the rural sector in Australia. Because while a number of our students will be taking this course from various parts of regional Australia, generally it's not totally well appreciated how important the rural sector is in Australia. That's largely because about 68% or about 2/3 of Australia's population live in only a handful of capital cities and their surrounding developed areas. This means that the other 30% occupy an awful lot of Australia. It works out to be something like over 99% of Australia is occupied by this 32% of non-capital city dwellers. And so it appears to be remote because there aren't too many people living in rural Australia. But on the other hand, about 2/3 of Australia's gross domestic product comes from regional Australia in the forms of mining and agricultural production, rural production, farming production. What this means is that something like 2/3 of our country's economic vitality is generated by 1/3 of the population, so it means that they're working really hard compared to us city dwellers. And to do it, they're occupying the overwhelming majority of the land area of our continent. And so this is important stuff. It's even more important from a property economist point of view because we're talking about a land use which is intimately connected with the land. I can build a university almost anywhere, perhaps even under the ocean. But if I want to grow grapes, there are only certain parts of Australia where I can do that, or bananas, or run sheep, or cattle, or sugarcane. And that means that the locational specificity of rural land uses is very, very important. Most of those people involved in rural enterprises tend to live in fairly remote and, in some cases, rather difficult circumstances, which is rather cruel when you think about it, because it means that those people in Australia who are most important for our economic production live in situations which are often quite deprived compared to the cities, where all of the good restaurants and universities and schools and hospitals and so on are. And yet they really provide the economic foundation, the economic dynamo for the entire country. And we see this even on individual state levels. Most of the economic force, the economic strength of Queensland, for example, comes from central Queensland, as opposed to the southeast of Queensland, where most of the people live, but relatively speaking, not nearly as productive. And a similar observation could be made about New South Wales or Victoria or any of the other states. It's the rural areas that are important. Understanding how rural land gets its value really takes us into a particular specialisation of property. And it's a useful specialisation for all of us to be interested in and familiar with, even if we don't anticipate working in the rural area. And the reason for that is that we have, in some cases, a relatively complex land use, intimately connected to the land, which is ultimately only valued in terms of its economic productivity. There's no use owning a farm if you can't farm it. I know there are exceptions growing up now with the rural residential fashion, which is coming in our communities, where around the edges of capital cities and even rural cities, regional cities, there's large areas that were once productive farms that are now simply very large house lots. But by and large, true rural land is a form of business, a form of income-producing opportunity for the people that live on it. And that's now, like so many other parts of our economy, becoming corporatised and so on, which is a story for another day. So valuing rural land is important because it gives us vital skills and experience in the activity of valuing businesses, and this has the added advantage that the business is closely, I'd say intimately, connected with the land itself. I could run a day care centre, and I could really run it in one of a number of spots. It doesn't really matter too much where the land is that I'm running it on. I could perhaps even run it on the top of a high-rise building, and perhaps there are more than a few that do that. However, in general, income-producing properties aren't that strictly connected to the land. It's a good time when we look at the question of rural property and what I've just explained as it being a specialised right, to look at the whole question of property rights. This is because land rights in rural lands, regional lands, tend to be one of the places where the whole concept of property rights becomes most interesting. For instance, in Queensland, there are a number of different ways of owning regional rural land. There's simple leasehold, there's freehold, there's road licenses and permits to occupy. So it's a lot more interesting and complex in some ways than, say, urban situations where the overwhelming majority of the property is simple freehold. And so it's an opportunity for us to come to grips with the complexities of leasehold and its meaning. It's also useful to understand the other aspects of property rights. We have customary property interests, often in rural areas, especially in the leasehold sections. So that's a specialised area that deserves attention. We also have the question of plant and machinery, because often rural properties have considerable plant and machinery as part of their operation, and so valuing a rural property means that we have to be sensitive to the importance of the plant and equipment, and also the distinction between improvements and the land itself. Controlling all of these different aspects is the whole notion of how property is managed for wherever we're working. And as you're aware, that is distributed between state legislation, which is usually the more important for land management issues, but also there's Commonwealth legislation, which we also need to be aware of. As we go through the study guide, and I would recommend very strongly that you follow up listening to this talk by reading the study guide, you'll find that there is a selection of relevant legislation, and some of it might come as a little bit of a surprise to you. Why do I have to be familiar with the Income Tax Assessment Act if I'm valuing a rural property? Well, it may not appear to be very relevant to a cattle property in central Queensland somewhere. However, it's very important when you have to understand things like tax implications and so on in the income calculations that are behind the business, which is really what the cattle station is set up to do. So there's a selection of legislation that you need to be aware of. There's a list in the study guide. I won't go through it now. You'll find that of the legislations that are listed, the most important are the various land acts in the various states, so be familiar with the Land Act in your own state. And if you are studying this from outside Queensland, similar to other units, you'll find that we probably have a bit of a emphasis on Queensland legislation, but use that as an opportunity to compare and contrast with your own state's legislation, because after all, you'll need to be familiar with your own state's legislation for your day-to-day work. So go through the legislation list in the study guide by all means. Doesn't mean you have to read all of it cover to cover, but it is important for you to be familiar, especially with the Land Acts, and put aside the task or the opportunity to at least become familiar, skim over, if you like, the other legislations that are being cited. Obviously, going back to the Income Tax Assessment Act, you're not going to read that thing. It sort of probably requires more reading than most university students would do in their entire course, just that one piece of legislation. But having a general understanding of it is fairly important. The Land Acts, by contrast, are going to be very much our stock in trade, so make sure that you take far more interest in those. And you'll need those not just for rural valuation, but also for your other advanced valuation work as well. Third area that is very important is the customary title area. There is a fair bit of Aboriginal native title legislation, both at a Commonwealth and state level, and it's important to be aware of it. And in some cases it can have an impact depending on where you're working and whether or not customary title has been fully extinguished or not. Generally, I've mentioned it earlier, it's important for you to at least open this up. Make sure you find the locations where the legislation is kept. AusLit website. It's fairly easy. If you simply Google or search for any one of the legislations, you'll probably find them sort of very easily. They do tend to move around a little bit, and so setting you a specific website is always a dangerous thing to do. But by all means, find them, bookmark them yourself, and become familiar at least with their generalities. When we look at the Queensland situation, to give you an idea of the overall structure, we find that there is an overall strategy, if you like, an objective behind the Land Act. And that is because it has to do with managing land for the good of the citizens of Queensland. The same could be said for citizens of New South Wales, Victoria or Tasmania, whatever. In Queensland, explicitly the 1994 Act, which is what we need to be aware of, is aligned with concepts, if you like, guiding principles of sustainability, evaluation, development, community, purpose, protection, consultation, and administration. And you'll find those aspects reflected in the details of the legislation. And we can go over what each one of those words mean. They tend to be fairly self-explanatory, especially, say, sustainability, which is very popular at present. But it all comes down to this ultimate objective of administration for the good of the community. One part of the community which is rising in importance, or has been rising in importance, is the importance of adequate respect to customary title owners, our Indigenous Australians. One way or another, we have the reality that white Australia, European Australia, however you want to conceptualise it, non-Indigenous Australia, arrived in Australia and basically took over the land which we would like to say as colonists, immigrants, non-Indigenous Australia was not owned, but the Indigenous people had a completely different view, which was ignored for the first couple of hundred years of settlement. And now we're coming to grips with how to recognise it without sort of ruining the non-Indigenous community and economy. And that very much is an ongoing process. And it's worth reading about some of the details as they're listed out in the study guide. And you'll find that this may be getting to be a familiar story. It's a story, though, that you need to be very conversant with. In rural Australia, considering about 40%, over 40% of Australia's land mass is held by leasehold, that's the privately owned, not the deserts and so on, that leasehold land is considered to varying extents and subject to review and investigation. It can be subject to at least some degree of customary title. The ownership of the property rights still remain with the Indigenous owners. And considering most of that leasehold land is in regional Australia, in the farming parts of Australia, these are important things to be very, very familiar with. So we need to read up on those. I won't go into the details at this point, but it's important for us to be familiar with at least the possibility of customary title and the impact that's likely to have on rural value.